Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar today to talk about BA4, especially on such a beautiful day. I think it shows a lot of commitment to passing your exams, and I think with this kind of attitude, you're surely gonna do well. So what I'm gonna do first of all is just get us off this holding screen. So my name is Anthony Williams. I work at Astranti and I'm in charge of the BA4 as well as the E pillars, so E1, E2, and E3. And of course, the title of BA4 is the Fundamental of Ethics, Corporate Governance, and Business Law. So today we're going to approach BA4. We're going to look at three topics that are common in BA4 of great importance, but also that you will find as you progress through your CIMA studies. Before we get going, I just want to highlight one important thing about BA4 that's going to be different to the other certificate level exams you're taking. That's that BA4 has 85 objective test questions. So obviously we've got more questions than in other certificate level exams. And that means we've got to approach the BA4 exam in a slightly different way if we want to ensure success. So the format of today's video is that we're going to look at three different topics, and in between the different topics, we're going to attempt a question. And I'm going to show you how I would approach questions and talk you through that process. Now, one of the really interesting things about BA4 is its pass rate. So we can see here in comparison with the other exams that actually the overall pass rate for BA4 is slightly down on BA1 and BA3. And in fact, the first time pass rate is kind of on the low side as well. And that might surprise some of you because I think the content in BA4, it can be considered less difficult than in other certificate level exams. So in preparation for this webinar, I started to think why the BA4 level pass rates might be on the lower side. And I think it's to do with the questions that you encounter in the exams. I think they might be quite a surprise. So what I'm going to do is show you how CIMA kind of create the difficulty for this content in BA4, because obviously in lots of the other certificate level exams, there's lots of calculations and they can be quite easily adapted to make them harder or easier. But of course, that's slightly trickier when we don't have any calculations at all, as we don't in BA4. So as I said, the format is we're going to look at three of the major topic areas. We're going to look at questions, and then at the end, you'll have 10 minutes to ask me any questions you want, and I will do my very best to answer them. So let me just click on from this screen a second. Okay, so just so we know what we're talking about as we go through the exam, here's the syllabus structure for BA4. And you can see we've got two major syllabus areas. There's business ethics and ethical conflict, which is a third of the overall exam. And we've also got corporate governance, controls, and CSR, corporate social responsibility. And that's a whopping 45% of the exam. But of course, the difficulty with these CIMA exams is you can't just focus on the big weighted areas because they're going to test every area of it. So it's really important as well that you're aware of the general principles of the legal system, contract and employment law, and company administration, because although they're a very small part of the exam, they're gonna be tested. So you're gonna need to know it. But that being said, the first two questions, or the first two areas we're gonna look at, do come from ethics and governance, because that's a really important area, and an area that if you really get to grips with at the BA4 level is going to stand you in really good stead right up to the case study after you take E3. And there's one more thing I want to show you before we get going to the actual theory. And these are the learning objectives, and the verbs hierarchy. Okay. So what CIMA have is they've actually got 5 levels, but levels 4 and 5 kick in around the management level and the strategy level. So what we're focusing here is the lower end of the learning objectives. And what I want to particularly draw your attention to is the level 2, because all of the questions in BA4 are at level 2. So what CIMA are testing is the comprehension. And the verbs you're going to find in the questions are describe, distinguish, explain, identify, and illustrate. And you'll find some of these crop up more than others. I suspect you'd find explain and identify the most. Now, that's not to say the level 1 won't be tested. Maybe you'll be asked to give a definition or state something, but the majority of your questions are going to have the verbs listed there. And as I said earlier, what I'm going to do is show you how a level 2 question can be made to feel very easy or actually pretty difficult. So I'm going to show you the easy end and the hard end, just so you know the levels you have to revise to. Okay, so let's zoom out of this area now, and we're coming to our first area of theory, and this is CIMA's ethical principles. And as I said, one of the major reasons that I've chosen this theory is because you're going to encounter it again and again and again in your studies. Because what CIMA want you to do when you're answering any kind of question at all, once you're qualified, is always to have the ethics at the forefront of your mind, no matter what situation you're in. CIMA always believe the financial management accountants should be always acting ethically. So I thought, what better way to start this webinar than talking about CIMA's ethical principles? And if we're going to talk about CIMA's ethical principles, then we also have to talk about the IFAC code. Now, IFAC stands for the International Federation of Accountants, and this is the global organization for the accountancy profession. And basically, CIMA's ethical principles have been adopted by those suggested by IFAC. So let's take a look now at CIMA's 5 fundamental ethical principles that you're going to see in BA4, E1, E3, and in your case studies as well. So they are all relatively simple. And in fact, even if you hadn't studied this information before, I suspect you could have a really good guess at what a lot of these meant. We've got integrity, we've got objectivity, we've got professional competence, we've got confidentiality, and we've got professional behavior. So already, I think if you were in an exam and you're being tested on these 5 principles without doing any revision, I suspect you could have a really good attempt at answering what these 5 principles actually mean. So let's take each of these principles in turn. And the first one we're going to look at is integrity. And just like in our personal lives, integrity in a professional manner means to be straightforward, honest, and truthful. And CIMA want you to be honest and truthful and straightforward in your professional and business relationships. And this should mean that the financial accounts that are produced by accountants with integrity actually really represent an honest and true representation of the financial position of the business. And of course, that's going to reassure stakeholders that they can trust the information that they're being given. Okay, so that's integrity, nice and straightforward. Like I said, being straightforward, honest, and truthful. Okay, so objectivity. Now, objectivity has a lot of similarities to integrity, but what exactly does it mean? Well, what we're talking about is for the financial accountants to be objective. And to be objective, it means that they can't be biased towards an organization. It means they have to avoid conflict of interest. And it means they have to avoid the influence of other people so that they can keep a really honest, straightforward, professional judgment of an organization's financial accounts. And so, for example, to protect objectivity, directors and staff should avoid relationships that could bias or overly influence their professional opinion. So let's imagine, for example, we've got a CEO who asked the accountant to amend the figures in return for promotion. The accountant should say, well, no, absolutely not. I'm going to remain objective and refuse, and actually just present the figures, present my information exactly as is required of me and my position. Okay, so that's objectivity. Let's move around now to our third of the ethical principles, which is professional competence. So professional competence and due care is basically an ongoing commitment to maintain a level of professional knowledge and skill. And this means that the accountant should really take care when they're preparing the statements and also make sure that they have the required skills and knowledge so that they are able to carry out their role correctly. So basically what we're saying here is that you as professionals should always make sure you have the knowledge and the skills that are required for your specific role at the specific time. It's you who has responsibility for this, to make sure that also, once again, you can present the financial statements honestly and accurately. Okay, then we move round to a word I know you're definitely going to be familiar with, and that's confidentiality. Now, obviously, as financial management accountants, you are going to come into contact with lots of information of organizations that are actually likely to be confidential. And one of CIMA's 5 fundamental ethical principles is you respect that confidentiality and don't share it if it's not appropriate. So a nice simple one for you there. And let's move around now to our 5th fundamental ethical principle, which is professional behavior. And this principle is all about making sure that individuals comply with the relevant laws and regulations. And this means that accounting standards and company law should be applied to financial statements. Okay, so there we go. We've got our 5 fundamental ethical principles. And surely that sounds pretty self-explanatory. This sounds okay, doesn't it? Surely BA4 can't be this difficult if this is one of the main elements. And to be honest, I don't think it is. I think the content itself can easily be worked out. The difficulty is when we're coming to the exams and applying it to our questions. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to another program, and I'm going to talk you through 2 questions based on CIMA's 5 fundamental ethical principles. So let me just switch over to my question writing software. And apologies, now I'm going to make a really horrible noise as I switch over my mouse to my new keyboard. I'm going to do that a few times. So apologies if you find it annoying, okay? So now we're in our new software, and you can see we've got a question in front of us. Now, at the top of the question, we've got something called a syllabus reference, Now, you're not going to have this in your exam. Basically, I've put this here so that you can see the question relates to something that CIMA want covered in the exam. And I've also written level 2 because this information has been stated by CIMA in their syllabus. It's going to be level 2 criteria. So that's comprehension. And you can see in this question, we've got a matching question, okay? And down the sides, we've got a nice, simple, clear idea of what we have to do, because you can see down the left-hand side are the 5 fundamental ethical principles that we've just talked down. And what we have to do in this question is simply match the principles that we've just been through to their descriptions. Now, this seems nice and easy, doesn't it? Because surely this is really basic revision that we have to learn and understand the terms. And this is something that you will come across in BA4. This is a nice, simple question that should take you a short amount of time. Now, I don't know how many webinars you've all sat on, but I know that webinar number 1 was all about exam technique. And I just want to talk about that really quickly, just in case you didn't come into the webinar. What we suggest at Astranti is that when you sit down for your exam, you do several passes of all questions. So I don't want you sitting down into your exam doing question 1, then doing question 2, then doing question 3, and maybe finding that quite difficult, but it's taken you quite a long time. And then when you've done that, you move on to question 4, question 5, etc. What I want you to do is to sit down in your exam ready, and I want you to go through the questions really quickly, and I want you to answer anything that you know straight away, immediately. And that would include a nice simple question like this, because you can see there's not a lot of text to read, so it's not going to take you very long to do it. And if you do these kind of questions on your first pass, what it means is you've given yourself more time per question to answer the more difficult questions, the questions you're not so sure on, and the slightly longer questions. So that being said, let's work through these 5 fundamental principles and get through to question 2. Now, we've just gone through all the different criteria of the 5 fundamental principles. So I'm not going to go through these again. We simply have to go on the right-hand side of the list and work out which is which. So obviously our first one is accountants should be straightforward. They should be honest and truthful in all professional relationships, okay? Now, hopefully, because we've just gone through pretty much that exact wording, that should jump out to you as integrity. So what we do here, instead of me matching it, I'm just going to write the answers in here. Obviously, in the exam, you would actually be dragging the question and the answer to each other. Okay. Let's move on to our second option, which is accountants should avoid relationships that could bias or overly influence their professional opinion. Now, of course, we've just gone through this criteria, but this is about making sure that accountants only trust their own judgment, and that judgment isn't swayed by any external factor, which is, of course, objectivity. So I'm just going to put 2 there. Then we're going to go on to number 3. Accountants must have an ongoing commitment to maintaining an appropriate level of professional knowledge and skill. Well, we know this one as well, don't we? This is professional competence and due care. We've just gone through it. Nice and easy, nice and quick. And then we've got number 4. Accountants must respect the sensitive nature of the information they access during the course of their duties, which is, of course, confidentiality. And then hopefully that should mean that number 5, if I just go down a bit, should be professional behavior. Now I say should be. One of the great things about matching questions is, of course, you're kind of checking yourself as you do the answer, because if this doesn't tally with professional behavior, I know I've made a mistake somewhere and I'm going to go through the options again. But obviously we've just seen the material, so I feel pretty confident about it. Accountants should comply with any relevant laws and regulations that may apply to them or their work. Okay, so I can just put a number 5 there, and we've completed the matching question. Now, I've just seen we've had a question come in. I'm going to keep the questions until the end, so I'll make sure I'll get to your questions at the end of this webinar, if that's okay. So there we go. That is the 5 fundamental ethical principles, and this is what I would call an easy question. But what we're going to do now is use exactly the same material, and I'm going to show you how it can be made to be more difficult, because I think this is one of the reasons why the BA4 has the lower pass rate, because the material seems quite simple, that when people get to the exams, they get tripped up by the complexity of the question. So we've had an easier question. Now, using exactly the same material, the exact same syllabus reference, so it's hitting exactly the same part of the syllabus that CIMA 1, it's still level 2. We've got a different style of question. And this is what at Astranti we call a scenario-based question. So what we always recommend, okay, before we read the scenario, is we go down to what's called the requirement line, because by reading the requirement line first, when you start to read the scenario, you're already automatically picking out the important parts of the puzzle, and that's going to help you answer quickly. Because remember, in BA4, we haven't got much time. Time is of the essence. So we've got to work quickly, and we've got to take shortcuts and learn little tricks where we can. Okay, so which of CIMA's 5 fundamental ethical principles has been put at risk? Okay, so we've got the 5 fundamental ethical principles, and we're looking for one that's at risk. And this question is a multiple response question. A multiple response, as you can probably guess, means that we're looking for more than one answer. And in this case, we're looking for 2 areas. So 2 areas where the 5 fundamental ethical principles have been put at risk. Okay, so now we know what we're looking for. We can have a quick look down at the answers. So we've got professional competence, we've got conflict of interest, we've got honesty, we've got confidentiality, we've got integrity, and we've got objectivity. Now, I can already automatically rule a few of these out to make this a little bit simpler on myself. And of course, I can rule them out because they're not actually CIMA's 5 fundamental ethical principles. But I'll do that in a second. Let's go back now to the scenario. We can start to pick out the important information that we're going to need. Daniel is an external auditor working for an auditing firm. He has been assigned to audit the accounts of company M. Okay, so Daniel is in an independent role checking the accounts of company M. So he's an external auditor. I'm going to highlight that information. During the audit, Daniel learns that an old school friend, is the CEO of company M. Delighted by the opportunity to catch up, Daniel ensures that his audit findings are overwhelmingly positive in all areas, even if some of company M's practices would usually be worth mentioning. Daniel does not tell anyone that his friend is associated with company M when the findings are reviewed. So one of the things I would highlight here is that Daniel is dealing with an old school friend, and that old school friend is the CEO of the company that Daniel is auditing. And we can also see that Daniel's really happy to catch up with his old school friends. So I'm just going to highlight the delighted there. And what he does is he makes sure that his audit findings are overwhelmingly positive, presumably so he doesn't have a really awkward meeting with his old friends when they finally run into each other. Now, what he does note is that company M's practices, some of their practices, I should say, would usually be worth mentioning, okay? But Daniel doesn't tell anyone about this when his friend, or doesn't tell anyone his friend is associated with company M. So we've got that as well. Daniel doesn't tell anyone, okay? So now we've got the information, we know what we're looking for, and we can approach the answers, okay? So let's have a look at them all. Select my green pen. So what about professional competence? Is this one of the 5 fundamental ethical principles that Daniel is at risk of? Because remember, competence and due care is about having an ongoing commitment to maintain a level of professional knowledge and skill. Now, I would suggest actually Daniel's skills aren't in question during this audit. We're not saying actually Daniel hasn't got the qualifications to become an auditor, just that he might be approaching it in a way that they shouldn't approach it, or he shouldn't approach it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a square around here because I think this is the wrong one, but I want to go through all my options first. Now, could it be conflict of interest? Well, I can rule this one out very quickly because conflict of interest is a part of objectivity, but it's not actually a 5 fundamental ethical principle. So this can't be one of the right answers. So let's put a cross through there. What about honesty? He doesn't sound like he's being very honest, does he? But honesty is also not one of the 5 fundamental ethical principles. Okay. What about confidentiality? So is Daniel respecting the confidential nature of the information required? Well, he's certainly been confidential about his relationship with company M, but of course, that's not what we're meaning. We're meaning is Daniel keeping all the information regarding company M to himself and to anyone appropriate working at the auditing firm. And we've got no reason to think he's not being confidential. So we can put a cross through here. Then we move on to integrity. Is Daniel being straightforward, honest, and truthful in all business and professional relationships? Well, no, he's not. Because what Daniel should be doing is saying, actually, to his auditing firm, I know the CEO of this company M. That might mean that in some way I'm subject to bias and perhaps someone else should carry out this audit. that would be up to the external auditing firm to decide. But Daniel hasn't done this, so he is not acting with integrity. This is one of the ones at risk. So is it A or F? Well, what we know is that Daniel knows the friend, and because he knows the friend, the CEO of Company M, actually, he seems to be showing the information in a way that actually isn't honest and representative of the actual information. He's saying his audit findings are overwhelmingly positive, even if some of Company M's practices would usually be worth mentioning. So to me, it says that actually he's been biased by his relationship with the CEO. So I think that's the right answer. And I'm going to go back and mark that one through, as I've pretty much eliminated that as a possible answer now. So what we can see as we come to the end of the second question for our first topic is exactly the same topic, but presented in different ways. And I'm sure you'd agree that question 2 is far more challenging than question 1, even though they're the same syllabus and the same topic. And this is what you've got to prepare yourself for BA4. It's having the information, but making sure you truly understand it so you can understand it in various real world scenarios. And that was why I would suggest that with BA4 especially, although pretty much with all certificate level exams, is you should practice questions before you actually sit your actual exam. Okay, so that is question 2 done. What I'm going to do now is go back to the presentation. There we go. And I'm going to make that horrible noise again as I bring my mouse back in. Much apologies for that. Okay, so we've done CIMA's 5 principles. So what we're going to look at now is another set of principles. And again, this in itself could cause confusion in the fact that we're dealing with sets of 5 OECD principles. And one of the things that CIMA may do is jumble up these principles, jumble up these wordings. So when you're in the pressure of an exam, it's think, well, actually, was this one of these 5 principles, or was it one of the 5 fundamental ethical principles? So you really got to make sure that you understand how the different principles fit into the wider context to make it easier for yourself when it comes to answering the exam. Okay, so we've got our 5 OECD principles, and you can see them on screen. But what exactly are OECD principles? What exactly is the OECD? Well, what we should start off with is talking about corporate governance. Now, corporate governance, as we saw earlier on at the beginning of this webinar, is a major syllabus area in BA4. And basically, corporate governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which a company is directed and controlled in order so it's very reliable and honest and accurate for all its stakeholders. Now, one of the most influential guidelines to international corporate governance is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and their principles of corporate governance. Now, I talk about these being international corporate governance principles, and that's because these principles aren't legal requirements for groups of countries. Instead, they're created so that governments of specific countries could use them as guidelines to help evaluate and improve the corporate governance in their own countries. And then each country can use those principles to set their own specific laws. Okay, so these are guidelines, principles to help governments improve corporate governance in their own particular countries. And you can see we've got our 5 principles again, which are the rights of shareholders, equitable treatment of shareholders, the role of stakeholders, disclosure and transparency, responsibilities of the board. So what I'm going to do now is go through each of these in turn, and there's slightly more information with these criteria than we saw with the previous principles. So let's have a look at the rights of shareholders. So basically, what the OECD are saying with the rights of shareholders is that corporate governance framework should ensure that organizations respect the rights of shareholders and help the shareholders to exercise their rights. Now, they can help shareholders exercise their rights by openly and effectively communicating information and by encouraging shareholders to participate in general meetings, because of course shareholders are the owners of the company. And what the OECD principles are trying to incorporate is to make sure that their rights as owners are respected, and that corporate governance, or the corporate governance framework of specific countries, is set up so that shareholders can easily exercise those rights. And one of the ways they can do them is by making sure the organizations hold general meetings and that shareholders can participate in those general meetings to voice their concerns or comment on the direction the organization is taking. Okay, then we've got another principle on shareholders, and this is the equitable treatment of shareholders. And this is saying the corporate governance framework should ensure that there's fair treatment for all shareholders. So, for example, if we've got a minority shareholder, they should be treated fairly. If we've got a shareholder in another country, a foreign shareholder, they should be treated fairly. All shareholders, no matter who they are, should have the opportunity to seek justice if they see a problem with the organization, or if they've seen a violation of their rights, there should be an effective solution to help them get a fair result for those violations. So everyone, shareholders big or small, should have their voices heard. Now, I talked in the first principle about the general meeting. Now, one of the ways that organizations can encourage shareholders to have their voices heard is through an AGM, an annual general meeting. Now, the AGM is held once a year, as you can probably guess from the name, and it's held with the board of directors, and the shareholders are in attendance. And at this meeting, a number of key issues are discussed and then put to a vote, which all the shareholders can vote on. And of course, what this means is that shareholders, through this vote, through this questioning process, are able to voice any concerns and then vote on any matters that they see fit. And so what we can see with this AGM is how important it is for organizations to give shareholders a voice. So our first two principles are on shareholders. Now we're moving on to a different group of stakeholders, and this is talking about stakeholders in its entirety. And this principle is ensuring that the corporate governance framework of specific countries that are using these principles as guidelines should make sure that organizations recognize that they've got a legal, contractual, social, and market-driven obligation to all of their stakeholders, whether they're shareholders or non-shareholders. So obviously, a non-shareholder stakeholder would be employees, investors, creditors, suppliers, local communities, customers, and policymakers. Basically, anyone that an organization may impact on. Okay, let me just bring up those notes for you. The framework shouldn't just stop there, though. It should also encourage active cooperation between corporations and the stakeholders in a bid to create wealth and jobs, and making sure that enterprises are financially sound and not suddenly going to go bust. So you can see we've got an example on screen. An employee is a stakeholder, and more often than not, they're a non-shareholder stakeholder. But obviously, an organization still has a number of legal requirements to make sure that their staff are being given appropriate training, resources, holiday entitlement, health and safety. The list could go on and on. Even though they don't necessarily hold shares in the company, it's obvious, isn't it, that employees are a major factor in the performance of a business, and so the organization has a moral duty of care over them. And this is what this principle is ensuring, that the stakeholders' role is recognized and encouraged. Okay, and then we move on to our next principle, which is disclosure and transparency. Now here, the corporate governance framework should make sure that there's timely and accurate disclosure made on all material matters. Now, if something's a material matter, it means that it's significant and relevant. And these material matters regarding the corporation are what should be presented in a timely and accurate manner. Now, this, of course, as you won't be surprised to find out, includes the financial situation, the performance, ownership, and governance of the company. And by disclosing all this information, it means that all investors have access to clear, balanced, and factual information. It means investors can make a true and honest decision about whether to invest in a company or not, because they've got honest and accurate records. Okay? Organizations should clarify and also make publicly known the individual roles and responsibilities of the board and management. Now, they do this so that other stakeholders have a level of accountability because they know which individual is responsible for what area of the business. Now, procedures should also be implemented to independently verify and safeguard the integrity of the company's financial reporting. Now, a good example of disclosure is a company's annual report, where a whole range of both financial and non-financial information is disclosed. Most annual reports are going to have a section on the governance of the business, and in that information, it will include details of the executive and the non-executive directors of the organization, and they're going to have a breakdown of their responsibilities and roles to make sure that stakeholders have that level of accountability. They know who has to answer to their questions. So there we go. That's disclosure and transparency. And our final principle is the responsibilities of the board. And here, the corporate governance framework should make sure that the board handles the strategic guidance of the company, the effective monitoring of management, and takes accountability for the company on behalf of the shareholders. And to do this, the board has to have sufficient and relevant skills and understanding so they can review and challenge the performance of the management in the organization. To do this, they also have to be of adequate size and appropriate levels of independence and commitment. Now, when we talk about adequate size, of course, larger corporations are going to have larger boards than smaller companies because they're going to have more responsibilities. But it's really important that the board understand the business and can challenge the management and make sure that management are guiding the business in the right direction to, again, safeguard the shareholders. Now, this principle also takes into account that those that are appointed to the board are done so because of their skills and their experience, their knowledge of the area, because sometimes people are appointed to the board based on their connections in the business world, or their familial relationships. So nepotism is when preference is given to a family member, or cronyism is when friends are appointed to positions of authority without having the required qualifications. And by making sure there's a robust board recruitment process in place, it means that findings of nepotism and cronyism are reduced. So there we go. There is our 5 fundamental principles. So what we're going to do now, once again, is take those principles, which we went through at quite a pace, I do appreciate that, and answer a question based on it. And again, I think this question would seem to be at the higher level of what you're going to find at BA4. So let me go over to the software for you. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to make that annoying sound again. I apologize as I unplug my mouse. Okay. So let's go down to question 3. And we can see for question 3, we've got a new syllabus reference, which has explained the purpose, the definition of the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, principles of corporate governance. And once again, just like with the 5 fundamental principles, the OECD principles are something you're going to continue to be questioned on throughout all of your CIMA studies. So if you get a good understanding of these principles, it's really going to help you out later on in your studies. So once again, we're going to do exactly what we did before and go straight down to the requirement line. Now, when I talked about studying or taking your exam before, I spoke about doing the shorter questions. Now, this would be one of the questions I would lead to my second pass of the exam paper, because obviously it's a bit longer, it's a bit more in depth. So what I want is more time dedicated to it. And if I've answered the simple short questions really quickly, it means I've made myself more time to answer these questions. Okay. So which of the following OECD principles of corporate governance are company B failing to adhere to most? Okay, so we've got a key term here again. We're looking for the negative. What are company B failing to adhere to? And of course, we're talking about the OECD principles that we've just been through. And we are looking for, once again, a multiple response. We're looking for the two that apply. Okay. So I'm just going to bring the screen up again so we can go through the scenario nice and smoothly. Okay, let me get my pointer, my laser pointer up. Company B is based in country Z, and it's trying to improve on its record of corporate governance and has collected information on its activities to identify governance failings. Well, that seems like good news. They're trying to improve their corporate governance record, and they're keeping activities and information on it. Every year, Company B holds an annual general meeting. Well, that's a good thing as well, isn't it? Because it gives shareholders a chance to voice their concerns, where the CEO and the chairman attend on behalf of the board and then form the shareholders based in country Z, which is where Company B is based, who are all invited to attend, okay? They outline all key issues since the last meeting and also give updates on the latest financial reports released, including which independent auditor they have appointed to ensure the integrity of the financial statements. Well, at the moment, it sounds to me like they're doing everything right. I don't know about you. During these meetings, the shareholders are allowed to ask questions, fantastic, about the running of the company, okay? So the shareholders are asking questions just like we spoke about, okay? The board itself is composed of a mix of executive and non-executive directors who skillfully manage the strategic guidance, management and operations of the company on behalf of the shareholders. So I'm going to highlight skillfully here because I know that's linked to one of the principles of the OECD. The board also work with the company's other stakeholders. Well, I know that's a principle as well, recognizing their various obligations towards the different groups. And then we come back to the requirement line, which of the following OECD principles of corporate governance are Company B failing to adhere to? And we're going to select the two that apply. Okay, so let's go through the options. The rights of the shareholders, the equitable treatment of shareholders, the role of stakeholders, disclosure and transparency, and the responsibilities of the board. So in this instance, we've got no easy options to get rid of. They're all one of the OECD principles. So let's work through each one in turn now. So the rights of shareholders, okay? So what do we know when we're talking about the rights of shareholders? Well, we know that an organization should have an area or a chance for the shareholders to ask questions, which we've got, and to vote on any important issues. So actually, when we first read this through, I thought this was one of the ones that were okay. But we see no mention that actually shareholders are allowed to vote on anything. And that means their rights aren't being given to by the organization. The lack of input into the company is a breach of the rights of their shareholders. So I'm pretty confident this is the right answer. So I'm going to put a tick here, but obviously I've still got to find one more answer and I've got to make sure that I'm right. The next one is the equitable treatment of shareholders. Well, surely this one's right, isn't it? Because they've informed the shareholders based in country Z, or Z, sorry, we're talking in English, that all the shareholders have been invited. That means that they're all being treated fairly, does it? Well, what about shareholders based in other countries? It makes no mention of them. In fact, it says they've only invited shareholders based in country Z. That means that not all shareholders are being treated fairly. They're not getting equitable treatment. So again, I would say this is one of the correct answers. So we can see we're having to give a real close reading of this text to make sure we're getting all these elements. And then we can move on to our options. So hopefully these are all wrong, because otherwise we've made a mistake somewhere. Let's have a look at the role of stakeholders first of all. So we know the board should recognize their obligations to stakeholders, and we do see, don't we, that the board works with the company's other stakeholders and recognizes their various obligations towards the different groups. So I think they are adhering to those principles. So let's put a cross by this one. What about disclosure and transparency? Well, we do know that they are disclosing all matters at an annual general meeting, even if they're not letting shareholders vote on it. So that's one good thing for disclosure and transparency. But it also we can see that the integrity is being assured by having an auditor, which I read somewhere, but I can't see there. Where is it going? Here we go, the independent auditor. Here we go. So I know that they are trying to disclose as much information as possible and be transparent. And they've appointed an auditor. So again, this is a wrong order. And then we've got the responsibilities of the board. And the responsibilities of the board is all about the skills and the appropriate experience of the board. And we know, I highlighted this, that the board is made up of a mix of executive and non-executive directors who skillfully manage the guidance, management and operations on the behalf of the shareholders. So again, that sounds like they're doing that correctly. So we've got our two answers: the rights of the shareholders, the equitable treatment of shareholders. So we can see we've got, again, a relatively simple concept, but put into a scenario which makes it far more challenging to answer. Okay, so we are, what's the time? It's 13 minutes to 2. Okay, so we're going to go through the next theory relatively quickly, and luckily I kept the relatively simple theory to the end. So let's go back to the presentation, and I'm going to make that annoying sound again. There we go, done. Okay, so let's move on to the final part now. Now this area comes from one of the smaller areas of the syllabus, one of the smaller weightings. As I said, of course, CIMA check every part. So it's really important you have a good understanding of the different areas of the syllabus. Now, contracts, I'm sure we've all come into contact with. We've got a simple definition on the screen for you. A contract is a binding agreement between two or more people that the law acknowledges and which sets out what they should or shouldn't do. Now, contracts are something we only encounter in BA4 in CIMA, but obviously we encounter them in our day-to-day lives, because obviously we wouldn't be able to have loans, we wouldn't be able to have mortgages if there were no contracts. Workers could be taken advantage of by their employers if there was no contracts. Someone could sell something and then say they'd never sold it if it wasn't for contracts. So it's really important, just for the day-to-day life, that we understand contracts, okay? And one type of contract is something called a simple contract. And a simple contract is made either in an oral or in a written form. And this is what the vast majority of contracts are. They're simple contracts. And by simple contracts, we mean they don't have to be in any particular form. Now, that sentence might make more sense when we talk about specialty contracts, because specialty contracts have to be in a specific form. They're often made in a deed or a signed and delivered agreement. Pardon me, I'm going to rephrase that. Specialty contracts are made by deed, which is a signed and delivered agreement. Now, we often see deeds used for the ownership of property or legal rights. And what's important to know is that, say, for example, in the UK, a house transfer, a property transfer wouldn't be legal if it weren't by deed. It couldn't be in the form of a simple contract. It just wouldn't be valid. And another term I want to draw your attention to is the discharge of our contract. Now, this is the term used for circumstances in which the contract is brought to an end. Now, where a contract is discharged, each party is freed from their continuing obligations under the contract. So basically what we've got here are three terms connected to contracts. What we're going to look at now are the elements required in a valid contract, okay? And this is one of the syllabus areas that CIMA referenced directly, which is why we're looking at it now. And we've already talked a bit about form. A contract has to have the correct form. So like I talked about, the sale of land in the UK requires a deed rather than just an oral agreement. So to be valid, a contract has to use the correct form depending on what's included in the contract. Then we've got a term called terms. Now, the terms used in the contract have to be appropriate. Now, what do we mean by appropriate? Well, an inappropriate term would be one that is requiring too much risk or loss. So, for example, a contract that states the other party had to tightrope across the Grand Canyon or the Niagara Falls would be inappropriate because there would be too much risk. Then we have the third term, which is consent. So this means that both parties involved in the contract have to enter it willfully. They have to want to do it and in good faith. They can't be tricked or coerced into it, and the contract can't be misrepresentative as to the true agreement of the other party. Now, if one party does give false information, it could affect the validity of the contract. So it's really important that both parties consenting to the contract. Then we have legality, and basically this means that if a contract is to be deemed by the courts to be legal, it can't be illegal. So for example, you can't have a contract to kill someone because obviously that is an illegal act. So the contract itself can't be valid. So that's really bad news for assassins. And then our final term is capacity. And this is making sure the person entering the contract or the party entering the contract has the capacity to form contracts. So for example, in the UK, those under 18 can't enter into certain contracts like a credit agreement, for example, or getting a credit card. So if they were to, they wouldn't have the capacity to, and so the contract wouldn't be valid. Okay, so there is contracts done very quickly, and what we're going to do now is switch back over to our questions, and you'll be relieved to know that I've chosen an easier question for our last one. So this would be the ones that I spoke about doing on your first pass, doing quickly. So we can see the syllabus reference, identify the essential elements of a valid contract, and situations where the law requires the contract to be in a particular form. So if I just get my pointer out again, let's press the wrong button. Is that going to work? There we go. So we can see that our answer was about identifying the essential elements of a valid contract. Well, we've just done that, haven't we? So it's question 4. And we've got a nice simple question here. Which of the following is not an element required in contracts? So, which element is not required in contracts? Well, we know, don't we, that form is, capacity is, covenant. What's a covenant? We didn't just do that. So this is a possible correct answer. And what about legality? Well, we know legality is an important part of a valid contract because you can't have a contract about an illegal act. So we know that this one is an element required in contracts. So what about covenant? Well, I recognize the term covenant. I know it's to do with contracts in some form, but specifically it's not an element required in contracts. So it is the correct answer because a covenant is an agreement which offers a solemn promise and could be part of a deed, or it could be standalone. Okay, but it's not an element required in contracts, although it's a term connected to contracts. Now we can see what we've got here is a much shorter, much simpler question. And this would be one that you do on your first pass really quickly to try and give yourself time to do those longer scenario-based questions. Okay, so that's our final question of the day. I'm going to go back over to my presentation screen and I'm going to make that annoying sound again, if you don't mind. Hold on, I've done the wrong thing there. There we go. I'll just get on the right one. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to make that sound again. I apologize. Okay, so what I would like to do now is to look at any questions that you might have pertaining to this BA4 exam. Okay, and I can see I've got a few up again. So I'm going to work myself through them. So I've got a question here saying, please explain objectivity again. So I know I went through it quite quickly, so apologies for that. So obviously objectivity is one of CIMA's 5 fundamental principles, okay? And if you're objective, it means that you don't allow bias into your work. So I use the example of someone being asked, or an accountant being asked by the chief executive officer to change the results of the accounts. And in return, the accountant would be given a promotion. So in effect, their objectivity is being challenged by doing this, because they might think, well, actually, I really want a promotion. So what I'm going to do is change these results slightly and I'm going to get promoted. But of course, the accounts aren't objective. They're not true anymore. And what we mean by objectivity is trying to get rid of this bias, trying to get rid of conflict of interest. So for example, we saw with conflict of interest in our question, the financial accountant knew the chief executive officer. So in fact, the accountant might have been trying to please the chief executive officer rather than presenting the facts as they were. So we can say that he wasn't being objective. And basically what we're trying to do is to avoid professional judgment being overruled. So it's all about making sure the work you do, the results you produce are true and you haven't been biased in any way. So hopefully that makes sense for you. Hopefully that answered that question slightly better than when I went through it originally. I've got another question here. Will there be any form of calculation for the exam or figures of any sort? So no, in BA4, and I think perhaps this is one of the reasons for the exam having quite low pass rates, is based more around the code that CIMA have, principles. We're talking about ethics. We're talking about governance. So there won't be any numeric questions at all. It's all on the topics we've seen in today's question, or in the same kind of question styles, in the fact there'll be lots of scenarios and there'll be close reading of the scenarios and applying the knowledge you've learned. Okay. Then we've got another question saying, I thought the necessary elements of a contract were offer, acceptance, consideration, and the intention to be legally bound. And you are, of course, right. But what we're talking about here is the terms associated to make a contract valid. So hopefully that clears that up. And then we've got another question here to do with more. Does CIMA have any BA4 courses that you run? No, they don't. But Astranti, as I said earlier on at the beginning of my presentation, I'm in charge of the BA4 pillar, and we produce study texts, revision notes, EPKs, which is exam practice kits, and mocks. So basically lots and lots of questions, and we provide all of those free. Oh, and we also provide tuition videos free, and I made the tuition videos. So you could listen to me talk about BA4 for hours and hours and hours if you wanted to. I'm not sure, should I by heart law to pass the exam? I'm not quite sure what that means. Apologies. The pass rate needed to pass for the exam. So CIMA is a scaled pass rate. So actually what I showed you at the beginning of the exam wasn't the pass rates needed, the amount of answers you needed. It was showing the pass rates of the exam as a whole. Apologies if I didn't make that clear. And basically what I was showing was that BA4 traditionally doesn't have the highest success rates of students passing it first time, or in fact passing it at all. And I found that quite strange, because I actually find BA4 content perhaps a little easier than the other syllabuses. And so I think a large part of that is people not knowing what the exam questions are going to be like, and thinking they're going to be like the last question we showed through, which is just showing you that you've learned a specific term. And actually, sometimes it can be quite complex, reading scenarios, then applying the knowledge. And then I've got another question. When you said the different areas are weighted, does each question in the exam carry the same marks? Yes, it does. So basically what it means is there's going to be more questions on those heavily weighted areas. So traditionally, if you go into, I don't know, say, if you did 50 of these BA4 exams, over those 50 exams, you would see a breakdown of like 45%, 30% of those main topics. And so you would spend most of your revision time revising those topics. But as I said, it's really important to learn all of it because you have to show competency in all areas of the syllabus. So unfortunately, you just can't forget about one particular area, however tempting that may be. Going down the questions still. Are we going to have this recording to go over? Yeah, I believe this webinar is being recorded, and I assume it's being shared. I don't know how you go about accessing it, but we've got some contact details on screen for you. So hopefully you'll be told how you can access it. But yes, it's being recorded. When is the next session? This is my last session. In fact, my first and my last with CIMA Ireland. I know the rest of some colleagues of mine from Astranti have gone through BA1, BA2, BA3, and also some exam techniques in 4 separate webinars. And again, I'm sure they've been all recorded, but unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly where to find them. But I'm sure if you contact one of these areas, you'll be able to find out how to access those materials. And I certainly know at Astranti, I think we're going to be sharing it as well. So hopefully you'll be able to get hold of these recordings. Okay, then can we access past papers? Well, no. And this is one of the problems with certificate level CIMA is that you've got lots of that you can't access these past papers. So each exam, different questions are thrown up, and then CIMA have this huge bank of questions. So my advice to you is to use some companies' practice exams. Now, as I said earlier on, at Astranti, we offer our certificate level questions free. And if you just practice those questions, then hopefully you'll be as prepared as you possibly can be when it comes to the actual exam. I know that Pearson VUE, who are the company that you will take your exam through, also provide, I think it's like 30 questions on each subject. So you've got an opportunity to practice and also an opportunity to use the software you're going to be using in the exam. So that's very nice of you. Thank you very much. Can I contact you for further help, even if I'm not from Ireland? Yes, you certainly can. I'm not from Ireland as well. I don't know if you could guess from my accent. I'm from Astranti, and we're based in the south of England and in Wales. You can just go to our website to find any information you want on BA4. As I said, it's all free. I think you just have to log in, give your pass, your email and that kind of stuff. And you can log in. Okay, I'm going to take one or two more questions. So are you saying we should expect this kind of scenario-based question in the exam? Yes, I am. So what I'm saying is you're going to have a variety of questions. Now, you've got 85 questions to go through in 2 hours. So obviously, you're not all going to be long scenario-based questions. You're going to have lots of the shorter questions that I showed you too. In fact, the vast majority are going to be these shorter questions. But be prepared for scenario-based questions where you're going to actually have to apply the knowledge that you've learned to pick out the best options rather than perhaps simply matching definitions or finding the missing term from a model. So that's what I would suggest. And this is what I wanted to highlight in this webinar. That is one of the reasons why I think perhaps the BA4 pass rates are a bit lower than anticipated. And then I've got a final question, I think. Is it effective to only practice Astranti questions? Well, I'm going to say yes, aren't I? It's only effective to practice Astranti questions, but there are lots of other providers who provide questions as well. So in the interest of fairness, I'm not going to say it's only effective to practice ours. And then I've got one more question before I go, which is if 5 people applied for a job and 4 of them don't have the required qualifications and only who has is my relative, if I engage him, can that be nepotism? Well, it's not in that instance, because what you're saying here is that your relation is eminently qualified for the role. And so by employing them or by appointing them to the board, it's not an example of nepotism. What we're saying with nepotism is they're being appointed to the board because of other relationships that bear no meaning on the role they're going to be carrying out. And I've just also been told that, yes, if you want these recordings, again, for all the ones that my colleagues have done and my one today, then yes, contact the all these details that you've got on screen: telephone, social media, or email. And there we go. Hopefully as many questions as I can answer. As I say, I'm Anthony from Astranti. Our certificate levels are on our website, and I've made some videos on this material. So look us up and help yourselves. Thank you very much for watching today. I think by you coming here shows that you're going to be very successful, because obviously you're showing the will to get through your certificate level and get on to your next level of your CIMA study. So good luck with all your exams, and thanks so much for spending the hour or so with me today.